Without me, he'd be living on the streets, my mother said with a smug smile in court. She sounded so confident that even her lawyer nodded along. Then the judge looked at me and asked, "So, they really don't know?" The room went quiet. My mother's lawyer frowned. "Know what?" The judge glanced down at the file, then back up. "The truth is," before he could finish, the color drained from my mother's face. She had been saying that line for 3 years, at Thanksgiving dinners, at church, to cousins I barely knew. "Poor Marcus," she would say, shaking her head just enough to sell it. "I pulled that boy out of nothing." What she never mentioned was the apartment. My dad died when I was 19. Heart attack, no warning. One Tuesday morning, he was drinking coffee at the kitchen table, and by Thursday, he was gone. He wasn't a wealthy man, but he owned one thing outright: a 2-bedroom unit about 20 minutes from where I grew up. Beige walls, old carpet, a parking spot that flooded when it rained, but it was his. And before he died, he told me it would be mine. I never got it. Mom sat me down 2 weeks after the funeral and explained the estate was complicated. There were debts, she said, fees, legal costs I didn't understand at 19. She spoke slowly and used words like probate and liens, and I nodded because I was grieving and exhausted, and she was the only adult in the room. By the end, she had explained there was essentially nothing left. The apartment had to go to cover what was owed. She told me I should be grateful she had room on her couch, so I slept on her couch for 8 months. I got a job, I saved money, I moved out and built something real, and she never let me forget it. Every holiday, every family gathering, every conversation that ran a beat too long, she found a way to remind everyone what she had done for me, what I would have been without her. The story never changed, only the audience did. I believed her version for longer than I should have. I was 19 when it happened. I had no reason to question paperwork I never saw. Grief does something to your ability to doubt the people you trust. I just accepted it and kept moving forward. 4 years later, I was at my desk reviewing a property database for a real estate client. Routine work. On a whim, I typed in my father's name. I don't know why. Some quiet itch I had never scratched. The record loaded in about 3 seconds. The apartment had transferred 8 weeks after my father died. Not to a creditor, not to a bank, to her. I sat there staring for a long time. I checked the address against the one I remembered. I checked the transfer date. I checked the name on the receiving end. Her name, her signature, her notary stamp. She had taken the apartment and put it in her name while I was sleeping on her couch, thinking I had nothing. While she handed me folded blankets and talked about sacrifice, she was already collecting rent on a property my father left me. I pulled up the rental history. She had tenants within 4 months of the transfer. Steady income every month for 4 years. I closed the browser. I went to the break room and got a cup of coffee I did not drink. I stood by the window for about 10 minutes. Then I went back to my desk and started writing everything down. I did not call her. I had watched her long enough to know how that would go. She would cry. She would reframe. She would make me the problem before I finished my second sentence. I had seen her do it my entire life, and I was not going to give her the warning. I called an estate attorney that evening. She asked me to bring the property records and anything tied to my father's estate. I spent the next 3 weeks pulling documents: the certified deed transfer, the original will, probate filings, rental income records. A letter my father had written that a relative quietly handed me after I asked the right questions. The attorney reviewed everything and did not mince words. The debts my mother described did not match the filings. There was no creditor claim that required the apartment to be surrendered. It had simply moved into her name while I was too young and too overwhelmed to look. We filed. She found out through her attorney and called me once. I let it go to voicemail. She sounded composed at first, then less composed. Then she said I was doing this to hurt her and hung up. I never called back. The court date came on a Thursday. She walked in wearing the expression she always wore when she believed she controlled the room. When it was her turn, she looked at the judge and said it without hesitation. Without me, he would have been living on the streets. And the judge looked at me and asked if they really didn't know. He already had the deed in his hand, the transfer date, her signature. 4 years of rental income collected on a property that was never legally hers to take. That is what the color draining from her face looked like. My name is Marcus, and the first thing you need to understand about my mother is that she is extraordinarily good at being believed. Not trusted, exactly. Trust is something you earn through consistency. What she had was more like a talent. She knew which details to emphasize, which emotions to let show, which words landed differently depending on who was listening. She had spent a lifetime reading rooms. By the time I was old enough to recognize what she was doing, she had been doing it for years. My dad saw it too. He never said so directly, but I remember small moments, a slight pause before he answered questions about money. The time I was 12 and he pulled me aside after a family dinner and told me quietly to always keep my own records of important things. I was 12. I didn't know what he meant. I do now. My dad's name was Gerald. He worked in property maintenance for most of his adult life. He managed repair crews for a company that owned a cluster of residential buildings on the south side of the city. It wasn't glamorous work. He came home most nights with grease on his hands and a thermos he'd been refilling since 6 in the morning. But he was methodical about money in a way that a lot of people in his position weren't. He didn't spend much. He saved steadily. He bought the apartment when I was 7 years old, paying cash for it after years of putting a fixed amount aside every single month. He was proud of that apartment in a quiet way. He didn't talk about it at dinner or brag to neighbors. But sometimes on weekends he would drive past it and slow down just slightly, and I understood without being told that he was checking on something that mattered to him. When I was 16, he told me it was going to be be mine. We were sitting in his truck outside a hardware store. He had the engine off but hadn't moved to get out yet. He looked straight ahead through the windshield and said that he had been thinking about what happened to families when somebody died without a plan. He had seen it at work. He had seen relatives fight. He had seen things disappear that shouldn't have. He said he wasn't planning on going anywhere soon, but he was going to be smart about it. He said the apartment was mine when he was gone. No conditions, just mine. I said okay, and he said good, and we went into the hardware store and bought caulk and sandpaper and didn't say another word about it. 3 years later, he was dead and the apartment was gone. The morning my dad had his heart attack, I was at school. I got a call just before noon. She told me to come home, said it quietly, in a way that told me before she said the actual words. By the time I got to the hospital, he had already been moved to a different floor. I sat with him for 4 hours before he died without regaining consciousness. My mother was in the waiting room for most of that time. She cried. People offered condolences. She received each one with the right amount of graceful grief, and I remember feeling, even then, even while I was barely holding myself together, that she was doing something slightly off, like she was performing the correct version of widowhood instead of just living inside it. I told myself I was being unfair. I pushed the thought away. The funeral was on a Saturday. About 60 people came, former co-workers, neighbors, people who had quietly respected him. They came, shook hands, said the right things, and left. My mother stood at the center and received condolences with a dignity people commented on afterward. She's so strong, a cousin told me. I don't know how she does it. I had no answer for that. 2 weeks after the funeral, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table. She had a folder in front of her. She folded her hands on top of it and looked at me like she was about to deliver news she had been preparing herself to give. She explained that settling an estate was more complicated than most people realized. There were debts she hadn't fully understood while my dad was alive, credit accounts, a small loan he had taken against his retirement account that she had only recently learned about. There were legal fees for the probate process, which was unavoidable. There were taxes. There were administrative costs that added up faster than she had expected. She opened the folder and showed me a few papers. I looked at them. They were dense with legal language and numbers and categories I didn't have the training to decode. She explained each one in a patient voice, the way you explain something to someone who is smart enough but simply doesn't have the background. By the end of the conversation, she had walked me through how the apartment, which was a part of my father's estate, had needed to be sold or transferred to satisfy what was owed. She said she had tried to find another way.
She said it had been hard for her to accept too. She said my father would have wanted things handled responsibly. She told me there was essentially nothing left. She told me the couch was mine for as long as I needed it. I was 19 years old and I had just watched my father buried and I didn't have another adult in my life I could take that folder to.
So I nodded and said I understood, and I folded myself onto her couch that night and stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about the apartment. I had no reason not to believe her. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't stupid. I was a 19-year-old kid who had just lost his dad, and the person sitting across from me with the folder was the only parent I had left, and she sounded completely reasonable and showed me actual documents. What she showed me was real. What she didn't show me was everything else. I lived on her couch for 8 months. I want to be honest about what that was like because it's easy to summarize it in a sentence and move past it, but those 8 months were the hardest stretch of my life up to that point. The couch was in the living room of her 2-bedroom apartment. They had been living separately for most of my high school years, in an arrangement nobody in the family openly discussed. The couch pulled out into a thin mattress that hit the floor on one side. The springs were uneven. I learned to sleep on the left 2/3. She was not cruel to me during those months. I want to say that because I think it matters. She made dinner most nights. She asked about my work schedule. She lent me bus fare when I was short and told me I could pay it back whenever. Individually, none of it was unkind, but there was a texture to those months I couldn't fully name. A constant low-level feeling of obligation. Every small kindness being deposited somewhere, accumulating interest. Every time she handed me money, she would look at me for just a half-second longer than necessary, and I would understand, without any words, that this was being noted. She introduced me to people as her son, who I'm helping get back on his feet. She said it matter-of-factly, like it was simply descriptive, but I noticed the slight lift in her voice when she said it. I noticed the way the person she was talking to would look at me with a particular kind of sympathy, and then back at her with something close to admiration. I noticed. I just didn't say anything. By month 6, I had enough to cover a deposit on a shared apartment across town. I moved out on a Sunday morning with 2 bags and a box. She stood in the doorway and said she was proud of me. Said it the way someone says a thing they have already decided is true, regardless of evidence. I drove away and told myself the hard part was over. It was not over. The thing about my mother's version of the story was that it had a very long shelf life. In the year after I moved out, she told anyone who would listen about the difficult months she had navigated, losing her husband and then devoting herself to getting her son back on his feet. She described the 8 months with the exhausted warmth of someone who had done something demanding but worth it. I heard versions of this account from relatives over the next 12 months. Each one had slightly different details. By the 3rd retelling, she had started taking me in 2 weeks after the funeral. By the 4th, she had quietly paid some of my outstanding bills, which never happened. I didn't correct anyone. I had learned that correcting my mother's version of events in front of relatives produced one outcome. She would look wounded. She would say something like, "I'm sorry if it didn't feel feel that way to you. And the relative would look at me like I had just kicked a woman who was already down. So I let it go. I focused on work. I had started at a real estate investment firm 18 months after my dad died. A professor at my community college knew someone there who was looking for a junior data analyst. The job paid more than the warehouse. I said yes. The work suited me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Real estate investment was fundamentally about information. Who owned what, when they bought it, what they paid. There was a precision to property records that I found calming. Numbers either matched or they didn't. The county record system didn't have feelings or versions of events. It just had data. I got good at reading it quickly. Within 2 years, I was handling portfolio analysis independently. Within 3, I was the person they called when something in a title chain looked wrong. I understood how property moved between owners. I understood how estates processed assets. I understood, better than most people my age, exactly what a real estate transfer looked like when it was done correctly. I also understood what it looked like when something was off. My mother came to a work event in my 3rd year at the firm. I had not invited her. She heard about it and arrived anyway. She introduced herself to my colleagues as Marcus's mother, the one who really got him through everything after his father passed. She said it warmly and people smiled, and I stood next to her and said nothing. My mother's calls became more frequent around the time I got promoted. Friendly on the surface, but underneath them was a current I had felt my entire life. Monitoring distance. Every call a kind of calibration. The year I turned 23, she started mentioning my dad more. Little references dropped into conversations. Your father always thought you'd do something like this. I remember when he talked about that apartment, he said it was for your future, and then she would move on without any apparent awareness of what she had just said. He said it was for your future. She had just repeated back to me the exact thing my father told me at 16. Said it in the context of everything she had done for me. As though the apartment she described and the apartment that was supposed to have been mine were two separate things. As though she had simply forgotten, or she had remembered, and was telling me just beneath the words that she knew. I never figured out which. What I know is that after that call, I started paying closer attention. I want to explain something about the 4 years between my father's death and the afternoon I found the property record. Because it wasn't a process of suspicion building toward a conclusion. It wasn't linear. It was more like weather. A slow change in pressure you feel in your joints before you see it in the sky. There were things that didn't add up. Not dramatically. Not in ways that meant anything individually. The estate paperwork my mother had shown me included an itemized list of debts and liabilities. I had looked at it for about 3 minutes before the numbers stopped making sense, and I nodded and moved on. But one line had stayed with me. It listed a mortgage outstanding on the apartment, enough to explain why there was no equity left. My dad had told me at 16 that he bought the apartment with cash. I had not connected those two facts for 4 years, not because I was careless, because grief is not a good environment for critical thinking. My father might have taken a mortgage later. Things happen. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. But I had started, by my 23rd year, to collect these small, unreasonable adjacent things the way you collect loose change, without a plan, just noticing that they existed. The second thing I had set aside was a conversation with my father's brother, my uncle Raymond, about 8 months after the funeral. He had called to check on me. Near the end of the call, he said my dad had been very clear about wanting to keep certain things simple. I asked what he meant. He said Gerald was organized. He liked things set up properly. He didn't like room for confusion. I said I knew that about him. Raymond said right, and then shifted to something else, and the conversation ended. I had thought about that exchange probably 100 times. What he said wasn't strange on its own, but the careful way he said it, the small pause before the word properly, the deliberate way he moved on, had the feeling of a sentence that was trying to say something it didn't have permission to say directly. I never followed up. I told myself I was reading into it, but I kept the moment. The third thing was the notary stamp. When I was 22, I worked through a title transfer discrepancy that taught me exactly what a notary's role was in a real estate transfer. A notary certifies that the person signing is who they say they are. The signature on the deed is authenticated by that stamp. That stamp is dated. That date matters. I had not been thinking about my father's estate when I learned that, but I filed it away. Those were the things I was carrying on the Tuesday afternoon when I sat at my desk and typed my father's name into the county property record system. I want to be honest, I was not expecting to find anything. I had a free 20 minutes between 2 client calls and a habit of running searches on a variety of names when I was learning a new corner of the county record system. I had entered my own name a few weeks earlier, just to see what came up. I entered my dad's name with the same low-stakes curiosity. The search returned one result, one property. The address matched exactly. The unit my dad had bought when I was 7, the one he had told me at 16 would be mine. And there, in the transfer history, was an entry dated 8 weeks after my father's death. Grantee, my mother's name. I stared at that screen for a very long time. The office was busy around me. Keyboards, phones, someone laughing at a desk 20 feet away. All of it distant. I clicked into the full record. The transfer was listed as an inheritance transfer, which meant it had moved through the estate process. That was the mechanism. It had been declared part of the estate and transferred to the surviving spouse, which was technically possible if the property had been titled in a certain way, or if the will had been structured to allow it, or if the estate documentation had been presented to the court in a particular way. Except my father had told me at 16 that the apartment would be mine, and my mother had told me the apartment was gone. sold, used to cover debts that no longer seemed to exist. I clicked over to the rental listing history. The property had been listed with a management company 4 months after the transfer. It had been continuously rented since then. The current rent was listed at a rate that, over 4 years, added up to a number I sat and calculated twice to make sure I had it right. She had been collecting that money for 4 years, while telling people she saved me from the streets. I opened a new document and started writing. Dates, numbers, what I knew, what I needed to verify. I wrote for about 15 minutes before I realized my hands were completely steady, which surprised me, because underneath the steadiness, I was experiencing something I did not yet have a word for. Not anger, not grief, something colder and more precise. I closed the document. I went to the break room. I poured coffee I didn't drink. I looked out the window at the parking lot and the gray sky above it, and I thought about my father sitting in his truck outside the hardware store when I was 16, looking through the windshield, telling me the apartment would be mine. I thought about all the times my mother had told people what she sacrificed for me. I thought about the 8 months on the couch. I thought about every family dinner where she let the story breathe a little and watched it land. Then I went back to my desk, pulled up the county record system, and started doing what I did every day at work. I followed the paper trail. The next 3 weeks were the most methodical I have ever been in my life. I did not rush. I did not confront anyone. I treated the whole thing like a professional problem, because that was the only way I knew how to approach something that large without coming apart. I filed a public records request with the county clerk's office for the deed transfer documentation. When the packet arrived, I went through it page by page. The deed transfer was structured as an estate inheritance transfer. My mother was listed as the transferee. The documentation referenced my father's will and a probate court filing that had authorized the transfer. I pulled the probate filing next. The will was included in the packet. I read the will 3 times. It left the apartment to me directly. My name, my full legal name, the property address. The language was clear. There was no ambiguity. But the probate filing told a different story. There was a creditor claim attached to the estate. It listed a mortgage on the apartment as an outstanding debt. The apartment had been transferred to my mother in a process described as satisfaction of the spousal interest combined with debt resolution. The will said the apartment was mine. The probate filing said otherwise. I pulled up the mortgage records. There was a lien on file from the period following my father's death. The lender listed was a small lending company I had never heard of. I spent 2 evenings researching it. It had been registered in the state about 11 months before my father's death. Its operating address was a registered agent service that handled dozens of shell entities. The company had issued a small number of loans and filed no regulatory reports since the year my father died. I wrote all of that down. I went to see an estate attorney named Patricia Osei, who practiced out of an office on the east side of the city. I found her through a referral from a colleague. I brought everything: the certified deed transfer, the probate filing, the original will, the mortgage documentation, the lending company research, a timeline I had built myself, date by date, from my father's death to the present. Patricia Osei was in her mid-50s, direct, methodical. She went through everything without saying much. When she finished, she set the stack down. She said there were significant questions about how the probate process had been handled. The mortgage claim had characteristics she would want to examine carefully: the timing of the lien, the nature of the lender, the speed of the transfer. All of it warranted a closer look. She said the will was unambiguous. My father had intended me to receive the property. For that intention to have been legally bypassed required a valid claim against the estate to have taken priority. Whether the claim was valid was the question. She asked if I had spoken to my mother about any of this. I said no. She said that was probably wise. She took the case. Over the next 6 weeks, Patricia and her associate dug into the records. The lending company had been incorporated by a registered agent, linked through a chain of filings to individuals who had incorporated and dissolved similar entities over the years. None of this was proof on its own, but it was a pattern. The mortgage note, when Patricia obtained the original filing, had a notarization date that fell outside the notary's active certification period in the county by 9 days. I thought of the title transfer I had corrected at work 2 years earlier. The honest clerical error with the notary date. This was not a clerical error. A notarization with an invalid date was a notarization that could be challenged. If the mortgage lien was improperly notarized, its validity as a claim against the estate could be questioned. And if the claim could be questioned, the transfer that relied on it could be questioned. Patricia said these were issues that would need to be litigated and that outcomes were never guaranteed. She said we had a strong foundation and a legitimate legal argument. She said we should proceed. I said yes. We filed. My mother found out through her attorney on a Wednesday afternoon. Her attorney was a man named Gregory Taft, who had a general practice office and handled a wide range of matters. Patricia told me afterward that Taft had called her within an hour of receiving the filing to request an extension and to ask whether there was any possibility of a settlement conversation. Patricia had relayed the question to me. I had said no. My mother called that evening. I let it ring and opened the voicemail. She was calm for the first 45 seconds, said she had done everything she could after my father died to manage an impossible situation, said there had been obligations that left no other option. Then her voice shifted. She said I was hurting her. After the couch, after getting me back on my feet, she said my father would be heartbroken. Then she said I was doing this to punish her, that I had always held held things against her. Then she hung up. I listened once. I deleted it. I did not call her back. The legal process took 7 months from filing to hearing. They were not easy, and I don't want to make them sound cleaner than they were. My mother called twice more in the first month. I didn't answer. I let the calls go to voicemail and deleted them without listening. That became its own small weight. Not guilt exactly. The particular exhaustion of closing a door you spent your whole life trying to keep open. I kept working. I kept my head down. I told almost no one. About 6 weeks after the filing, my mother began making contact with relatives. My cousin Dana called and told me. My mother had been telling people I was pursuing legal action over a misunderstanding about the estate, that she was devastated and didn't understand what she had done to deserve this. She had not mentioned the apartment, not the will, not the lien or the 4 years of rental income. She had positioned herself as a grieving widow being attacked by her own child, and she had done it early and broadly enough to shape the narrative before I had said a word to anyone. I wasn't surprised. I told Dana the truth, all of it. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, I wondered. She said that around the time my dad died, Raymond had said something to her. That Gerald had been very organized about that apartment, that it was all set up properly for Marcus. Dana had always assumed it went away because of estate complications, but Raymond's comment had sat oddly with her. I asked if Raymond was someone I could talk to. She said she would reach out first. I said yes. Raymond met me for coffee the following weekend. He had my father's eyes and the same stillness. He waited until we both had coffee in front of us before he said anything. He said he had been waiting for someone to ask him. Gerald had talked to him about the apartment a few weeks before he died. They had gotten together to watch a game, and Gerald mentioned, without much preamble, that he had gotten his affairs in order. He had a will. The apartment was specifically named and specifically designated for me. Gerald had said he wanted there to be no room for confusion. Raymond had asked why he was telling him this. Gerald had said, because I want someone in the family to know. Besides her, Raymond had not asked what that meant. After Gerald died, he had waited to see what happened. When the apartment was gone, he had not been certain enough of anything to come forward. He had thought about it. He had decided he couldn't prove anything. He looked at me and said he was sorry. I said it wasn't his fault. I told him what I needed was a written account of what my father had said. He said he had already started writing it down. Patricia Ose received Raymond's written statement and incorporated it into the case file. She said it was corroborating but not decisive, since it was a recollection of a conversation. What it did was support the overall picture that my father had intended the property for me and had taken specific steps to ensure it, which made the subsequent transfer less likely to be a simple estate administration error. Patricia's associate had located the attorney who drew up my father's will. He was a retired estate attorney named Harold Simmons, who confirmed he had prepared the document, that the language was intentional, and that Gerald had been explicit about wanting the apartment designated specifically to me. He provided an affidavit. A documentation expert reviewed the notary issue and submitted a written analysis that the notarization date fell outside the notary's active certification window and that the document had a validity defect. We had the will, Raymond's statement, Harold Simmons's affidavit, the expert analysis, 4 years of rental income records. Patricia said we were in a strong position. I said I knew. What I didn't say was that strength wasn't really what I was feeling anymore. By then, I had spent months inside the evidence. I had read my father's will 100 times. I had thought about the hardware store conversation when I was 16. I had thought about what he meant when he told Raymond he wanted someone in the family to know. I had thought about the couch, about folded blankets, about the morning I drove away with 2 bags and a box while she stood in the doorway saying she was proud of me. I wasn't angry. I had passed through angry somewhere in month 2 and come out the other side into something quieter and more final. I was just done being someone else's story. The pre-hearing deposition took place on a Friday morning in a conference room at Patricia's office. My mother came with Gregory Taft. She wore a dark blazer. She sat across the table from Patricia and me and folded her hands in front of her in a way that was composed and deliberate. Patricia conducted the questioning, methodical and calm. She started with background, then asked about the apartment. My mother said it had been part of the estate, handled through probate. Patricia asked who had managed it. My mother said she had, with the assistance of an attorney. Patricia asked whether my father had ever discussed his wishes regarding the apartment. My mother paused. Brief, barely perceptible if you weren't paying attention. I was paying attention. She said my father had talked generally about wanting to provide for the family. Patricia placed a copy of the will on the table, asked whether my mother recognized it. She said yes. Patricia asked whether she had been aware that the will specifically named me as the designated recipient of the apartment. My mother looked at Gregory Taft. He said nothing. She said she had understood the will had been superseded by the estate debt obligations. Patricia placed the mortgage document next to the will. She noted the filing date, asked whether my mother was aware of the loan at the time it was taken out. My mother said she and my father had handled finances jointly. Patricia asked whether she was aware that the notary certification was dated outside the notary's active certification window in the county. Gregory Taft interjected. Outside the scope, Patricia acknowledged him and moved on. At the end of the deposition, my mother stood, straightened her blazer, and left without looking at me. Gregory Taft lingered and told Patricia his client remained open to a settlement discussion. She related. I said no. The night before the court date, I did not sleep well. There is a version of this kind of story where the protagonist is calm and resolved, where they sleep soundly because they know justice is coming. That was not my experience. I lay in my apartment staring at the ceiling and thought about my dad, not the case, not the evidence, about the coffee at the kitchen table, the hardware store, the way he slowed down when he drove past that building, the particular kind of pride he had that never needed an audience. I thought about what it would have meant to him to know that someone had simply absorbed the thing he spent years building, renamed it, rented it out, pocketed the difference, while telling everyone what a sacrifice it had been to take care of his son. I got up at 5:30 and made coffee and got ready for court. The hearing was in a small civil courtroom on the 4th floor of the county courthouse. Institutional carpet, fluorescent lighting, wooden benches. A few relatives had come. I had not told anyone to come. Dana was there. Raymond was there, sitting quietly near the back. My mother arrived with Gregory Taft, composed. She wore the same dark blazer from the deposition, and she looked like a woman who had rehearsed confidence so many times it had become reflexively indistinguishable from the genuine article. She did not look at me when she came in. The judge was Honorable Carter Webb, 14 years on the civil bench. Patricia had described him as someone who read case materials thoroughly and had a low tolerance for procedural games. He came in, settled behind the bench, and already had our file in front of him. He called the matter. He asked both sides to confirm appearances. He said he had reviewed the submitted documentation and had some questions. Gregory Taft went first. He laid out my mother's position with the fluency of someone who had spent the week polishing an argument he knew was weaker than he was presenting it. He emphasized the complexity of estate administration. He emphasized that his client had acted in good faith based on the information available during the probate process. He emphasized that the mortgage obligation had been a legitimate claim against the estate. Patricia went next. She was measured and precise. She presented the will. She presented Raymond's statement. She presented Harold Simmons's affidavit. She presented Marcus Freed's documentation analysis regarding the notarization defect. She walked Judge Webb through the timeline date by date, from my father's death to the transfer to the rental listing to the present. Then it was my mother's turn to speak. She stood. She straightened. She looked at Judge Webb and said that she had done everything she could to manage a devastating situation after losing her husband. She said the estate had been complicated and she had relied on guidance from advisors. She said she had provided for her son during the hardest months of his life and that this proceeding was painful beyond what she could easily express. And then she said it. Without me, he would have been living on the streets. I heard it from across the room and it landed the same way it always had. The practiced sincerity, the just enough weight in her voice. But this time the judge was looking at the case file. He looked up from it and looked at me. So, he said, they really don't know? My mother's attorney frowned. Know what? The judge glanced down at the file, then back up. The truth is, he said, and he left the sentence open for just a moment. And in that moment, I watched my mother's face change. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just a slow draining of certainty. The way color leaves a face when the body understands something before the mind catches up. He had the deed in his hand. He had the notarization analysis. He had Harold Simmons's affidavit and Raymond's statement and 4 years of rental receipts. He looked directly at my mother. Mrs. Carter, he said, the property records and the documentation before this court present a picture that is, at minimum, significantly inconsistent with what you have described. I have a number of questions. She sat down. Gregory Taft leaned over and said something to her quietly. She nodded once. Her hands were in her lap. They were very still. The judge asked about the mortgage. He asked about the lending company. He asked about the notarization date. He asked about the gap between the estate filing and the first rental listing on the property. He asked each question in the same even tone, and my mother answered each one through Gregory Taft in careful, hedged language that added up to a great deal of maneuvering without ever producing a clear answer. At one point, the judge asked, simply and directly, why the property had been rented out rather than sold to satisfy the estate debt. Gregory Taft objected that the question went beyond the scope of the current proceeding. Judge Webb looked at him for a moment. He sustained the objection, but the question was in the room. It had been asked, and everyone present had heard it and understood what it implied. It implied that if the apartment had been transferred to satisfy a debt, selling it would have been the logical resolution. Renting it out and collecting income was a different decision, a decision that assumed ownership. The hearing concluded with Judge Webb stating that he would be taking the matter under advisement and would issue a ruling within 30 days. He asked both parties to submit any additional documentation within the following 2 weeks. 31 days later, Patricia called me. The ruling had come in. Judge Webb found that the mortgage claim had not been adequately substantiated and that the notarization defect raised sufficient questions about the document's validity to undermine its standing as a priority claim. He found that the property had been transferred in a manner inconsistent with my father's will. He ordered a corrective proceeding and a full accounting of rental income for the relevant period. Patricia said full resolution would take additional months. We were in very good shape. I thanked her and said I would be in touch. Then I sat in my apartment for a while without doing anything. I thought about my dad, about the fact that what he intended had survived, that the paper he had signed in some quiet attorney's office with the specific careful language he had used had eventually been read by someone in a position to act on it, that his voice, in its way, had been heard. I don't know exactly what I expected justice to feel like. I think I had imagined something arriving, something finally given back. What it felt like was the end of a long holding of breath. The months that followed were procedurally dense. A court-appointed CPA reviewed the rental records and produced a figure representing the total income collected from the property. The figure was significant. My mother's attorney submitted objections. Patricia addressed each one. The back and forth took 4 months. Relatives reached out in a variety of ways. Dana called regularly. Raymond sent a brief message saying he was glad and that my father would have been relieved. A few cousins sent awkward texts. I responded briefly and without detail. A few said nothing at all. I had expected that. People who have organized their understanding of a family around one person's account don't dismantle it quickly, and some never do. I did not try to change anyone's mind. The record was public. Anyone who wanted to look could look. My mother did not contact me again during this period. The final resolution came through on a Tuesday, almost exactly 14 months after I found the property record in the county database. The settlement included a structured payment representing the rental income, the appraised value relative to what would have been my inheritance, and adjustments for the intervening period. When it was over, I sat down with Patricia, and she walked me through the final numbers. I said, "Thank you." I meant it simply. She said the documentation I had brought her in the first meeting was the cleanest, self-assembled case file she had seen from a layperson. She asked whether I had legal training. I said no. I said I just paid attention. She smiled and said that was usually enough. I left her office on a clear afternoon in November. I walked to my car. I sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. The apartment still existed. It was still rented. The resolution was financial, not physical. I was not going to move into it. I was not going to manage it. I was going to receive what my father had intended me to receive in the form that made the most practical sense given everything that had transpired since his death. It wasn't the same as what he meant to give me. It couldn't be, but it was something true. I thought about him in that truck when I was 16. The engine off, the windshield, the quiet way he said it would be mine. I thought about all the years I had believed the other story, not because I was foolish, because I was young and grieving, and the person telling it was my mother, and she was very good at being believed. I thought about the Tuesday afternoon 4 years after his death, when I typed his name into a database on a whim, and the record loaded in 3 seconds, and everything rearranged itself around a fact that had been sitting in public records the whole time. I started the car. I drove home. I have thought a great deal, in the time since, about what any of this means. People who know the full story ask me what the hardest part was. They expect the courtroom, the deposition, the night before. The answer is the 8 months on the couch, not because she was unkind. The hardest part was the texture of those months, the low-level performance of generosity, the way every small kindness came with its invisible ledger, the way I left every morning feeling like I owed something I couldn't name and couldn't ever fully repay. And the worst part is that she believed it too, or she had convinced herself thoroughly enough that it functioned the same way. She had transferred a property into her name, collected the rent, and built in its place a story about sacrifice that she told so many times it became the thing she remembered when she stood up in court. I don't know how a person gets there. What I know is that the story she told did real damage. Not the big dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that makes a kid spend years feeling like he owes a debt that was constructed out of something that was already his, the kind that teaches you to stay quiet. I am not quiet anymore. My dad left me something. It took 14 months of documented evidence, 2 attorneys, 1 retired estate attorney's affidavit, 1 expert analysis, and 1 county judge to get it back. But he left it and it got back to me, and that is the version of the story I carry. The apartment is still there. Beige walls, probably. Old carpet, maybe replaced by now. A parking spot that probably still floods when it rains hard. He bought it with cash. He drove past it slowly on weekends. He told me at 16 that it would be mine, in a truck outside a hardware store with the engine off, looking through the windshield at nothing in particular. It was always mine. That is what the color draining from her face looked like.